Before the first temple was raised, before scripture was standardized, before belief was regulated, audited, and approved, there were stories that did not survive because they were false. They survived because they were dangerous. Dangerous not to faith, but to control. Long before doctrine hardened into certainty, ancient writers recorded a world that does not resemble the one later religion would present as perfect. A world where divine authority fractured, where guardians failed, where knowledge arrived too early, and where humanity became collateral in a conflict it did not initiate. These accounts were not preserved in triumph. They were buried, scattered across deserts, sealed in caves, fragmented into languages few could read, and dismissed as heresy by those who understood exactly what they implied. At the center of those fragments is a text that should not exist at all, a text referenced by Scripture, quoted by apostles, foundational to early belief, yet excluded from the canon that would define Western civilization. A text that refuses to explain suffering as a moral test, a text that refuses to portray power as infallible, a text that documents a system failure at the highest level of reality. This is the Book of Enoch. And its survival is an accident only if you believe history is neutral. The Book of Enoch does not begin with creation. It begins with observation. Enoch is not a priest, not a king, not a warrior. He's a witness, a recorder of events that were already in motion when he entered the story. That detail matters because witnesses threaten narratives built on authority. They describe what happened, not what should have happened. And the world Enoch describes is already compromised, already unstable, already carrying the consequences of decisions made beyond human reach. The text introduces beings called the Watchers, not as metaphors, not as symbols, not as poetic abstractions, but as entities assigned oversight. They are tasked with watching humanity, not ruling it, monitoring, not interfering, maintaining order, not reshaping outcomes. And yet, they descend. This is not framed as temptation, it is framed as authorization breached, protocol violated, boundaries crossed. The Watchers take wives, they teach forbidden knowledge, they alter development, and in doing so, they introduce an asymmetry that destabilizes the world. The Book of Enoch does not describe humanity discovering civilization, it describes civilization being introduced prematurely. And that distinction changes everything, because discovery implies readiness, introduction implies interference. The knowledge given is specific: metallurgy, weapon forging, astronomy, calendar systems, cosmetics and enhancement, sorcery and manipulation of perception. These are not moral lessons, they are accelerants. And accelerants do not ask whether a system can handle the speed. The result is predictable. Hybrid beings are born, the Nephilim, not spirits, not legends, physical entities described with size, hunger, and violence. They consume resources faster than the environment can sustain. They turn on humanity. They devour everything. And the earth begins to fall. The Book of Enoch does not frame this as divine punishment. It frames it as ecological collapse, system overload, and containment failure, which forces an uncomfortable question. Why does this text sound less like a myth and more like an after-action report? Because myths resolve chaos. Reports document consequences, and the consequences described in Enoch are not symbolic. They are logistical. Population imbalance, resource depletion, violence escalation, and environmental destabilization. This is not a morality tale. It is a failure cascade. When the situation becomes untenable, intervention finally occurs. But not to save the Watchers. They are arrested, bound, imprisoned beneath the earth, not destroyed, contained, awaiting judgment. That detail should stop you cold, because destruction erases risk. Containment acknowledges persistence. You do not imprison something that no longer matters. You imprison something that remains dangerous. The giants are destroyed, humanity is reduced, the flood occurs. And here is where the narrative diverges sharply from later theology. The flood is not portrayed as purification, it is triage. A reset to prevent total collapse. Life continues, but damaged, altered, carrying the residue of forbidden knowledge without the context to wield it responsibly. And then the text does something extraordinary. It refuses to end cleanly. There is no restored perfection, no triumphant resolution, only waiting, judgment deferred, entities imprisoned until a future reckoning, as if the system itself has paused, waiting for a condition that has not yet been met. This is not religious comfort, it is existential unease, and it is precisely why the Book of Enoch could not be allowed to stand at the center of belief. History didn't disappear. It was rewritten. This is the broken truth. Welcome to the Broken Truth Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett. This episode is not about angels. It is not about giants. It is about narrative control. It is about the stories that survive long enough to be buried deliberately. And it is about why some truths are too destabilizing to canonize. Before we get started, follow the Broken Truth Podcast on the platform you're listening on. Leave us a 5-star review, share this episode, and comment your thoughts below. Because once you understand why Enoch was removed, you begin to recognize the architecture of omission everywhere else. The official explanations for Enoch's exclusion sound reasonable until you examine them closely. Disputed authorship, theological inconsistency, non-Hebraic origins. But these arguments collapse under historical pressure. The same institutions that rejected Enoch preserves texts with weaker provenance. The same authorities that warned against its cosmology quietly absorbed its concepts. Layered heavens, imprisoned angels, a final judgment involving beings awaiting release. These ideas do not originate cleanly in canonical scripture. They originate in Enoch, which raises the question no institution wants to ask. If Enoch was unreliable, why was it foundational? And if it was foundational, why was it removed? The answer lies not in theology, but in power management. Enoch introduces failure at the highest level of authority. It suggests that divine administrators can err, that oversight can lapse, that intervention can contaminate rather than correct, and that humanity's suffering may not be the result of rebellion, but inheritance. This is catastrophic for systems built on obedience, because obedience requires moral clarity. And Enoch introduces moral ambiguity where authority resides. It relocates responsibility upward, and power has always resisted accountability. This is why Enoch had to be reframed as dangerous. Not because it undermined belief, but because it complicated blame. It suggested that humanity did not fall alone. It was pushed, and then judged for landing badly. To understand why the Book of Enoch was pushed to the margins, you have to stop thinking in terms of religion and start thinking in terms of governance. Not divine governance, but narrative governance. Every civilization survives on a controlled explanation of how the world works, who holds authority, and why suffering exists. Once those explanations fracture, obedience weakens, loyalty erodes, power becomes accountable. Enoch fractures the explanation at its foundation. It does not portray the universe as a flawless hierarchy flowing downward from perfection. It portrays it as an administered system, one that requires oversight, enforcement, and correction. That distinction changes everything, because administered systems can fail, and Enoch documents failure. The Watchers are not rebels in the modern sense. They do not overthrow authority. They do not challenge the throne. They violate jurisdiction. They cross a boundary they were never meant to cross, and the consequences are not moral, they are structural. Once the boundary collapses, separation dissolves, heaven and earth blur, power moves where it was never designed to exist. This is why Enoch's language is so precise. These beings are not described as falling in a poetic sense. They descend, they take action, they teach, and they modify. Their transgression is procedural, and procedural violations are the most dangerous kind, because they undermine the system without announcing themselves as rebellion. The knowledge they introduce is not framed as enlightenment. It is framed as imbalance. Humans gain the ability to shape their environment faster than their social structures can adapt. Violence scales, hierarchies harden, exploitation becomes efficient. The Book of Enoch does not blame humanity for this outcome. It describes humanity as unprepared recipients. That single framing decision destabilizes centuries of later doctrine, because later theology requires the belief that humanity chose corruption. Enoch suggests corruption arrived first, and once it arrived, it could not be undone. This is also where Enoch becomes deeply uncomfortable for modern readers, because its logic does not belong to the ancient world. It belongs to systems theory. The idea that complex systems collapse not because of evil intent, but because of unmanaged variables. That failure often originates upstream, not downstream. The consequences propagate outward from points of authority. The containment becomes necessary when reversal is impossible. Enoch's flood narrative fits this model perfectly. The world does not end. It is stabilized. Life continues in a reduced, controlled state. Variables are minimized. Continuity is preserved. This is not divine wrath. It is risk management, which forces another disturbing consideration. What if the earliest religious narratives were not designed to inspire worship, but to document catastrophe? What if later generations reinterpreted incident reports as moral parables because the original context was too destabilizing to preserve? That possibility explains something scholars have long struggled to reconcile. Why does Enoch feel technologically literate in ways other texts do not? Why does it obsess over measurements, calendars, trajectories, and cycles? Why does it describe time as regulated, monitored, and corrected? Because the universe Enoch describes is not symbolic, it is operational. Time follows assigned paths. Celestial bodies obey enforced courses. Deviation is recorded. Correction is inevitable. This is not mythology. Myth glorifies chaos. Enoch fears deviation, and fear implies experience. Another reason Enoch could not remain central is its treatment of judgment. In later theology, judgment is moral and final. In Enoch, judgment is delayed and conditional. The watchers are imprisoned, not executed. They are sealed in darkness, awaiting a future evaluation. This implies something later doctrine cannot allow, that authority itself is subject to review, that power can be suspended, that even those closest to the source are not above accountability, and that judgment requires time. Time to observe outcomes, time to understand consequences, time to determine responsibility. This is not divine absolutism. It is administrative justice. And administrative justice terrifies institutions that rely on unquestionable authority, because once authority is framed as administrative, it becomes procedural, and procedures can be audited. This is where Enoch becomes truly dangerous. It invites the reader to see reality as a system, not a mystery, not a test, a system with inputs, failures, corrections, and thresholds. And systems invite analysis. Analysis invites critique. Critique invites reform. The Book of Enoch also destabilizes another pillar of later belief: inevitability. In canonical theology, history unfolds according to divine plan. In Enoch, history unfolds reactively. Intervention leads to consequence. Consequence demands correction. Correction introduces new instability. Nothing is inevitable. Everything is contingent. This worldview does not produce passive believers. It produces observers, and observers are difficult to control, which brings us to the most suppressed aspect of Enoch's influence: its survival in early Christianity. For centuries, Enoch was treated as authoritative. Early Jewish sects preserved it. Early Christian writers quoted it without hesitation. The Epistle of Jude references Enoch directly, not symbolically, but directly. Yet as institutional Christianity solidified, Enoch quietly vanished from approved scripture, not because it contradicted the emerging doctrine, but because it exposed its scaffolding. Enoch explained too much. It left too little room for unquestioned obedience. It introduced a past where divine authority failed, and a future where judgment remained unresolved. A religion built on certainty cannot survive that tension, so Enoch was labeled as apocryphal. Useful for scholars, dangerous for congregations, and slowly removed from the center of belief. But removal does not equal erasure. The concepts remained: imprisoned angels, layered heavens, the final judgment deferred. Ideas were absorbed, sanitized, and redistributed without their destabilizing context. The story remained. The implications were stripped. This is how power edits history, not by deleting facts, but by reframing meaning, by keeping the language and removing the responsibility. The result is a belief system that inherits Enoch's cosmology without Enoch's accountability. And that may be the most profound legacy of its suppression, because it allowed authority to appear flawless, human suffering to appear deserved, and systemic failure to be reframed as moral weakness. The Book of Enoch resists that reframing. It insists that corruption has an origin, that suffering has a cause, and that cause may not reside where we have been taught to look. Follow the Broken Truth podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. Leave us a 5-star review, share this episode, and comment your thoughts below. Not as agreement, as engagement, because silence is how incomplete stories become permanent truths. What remains unresolved and deeply unsettling is the question Enoch leaves behind. If the world was destabilized once by unauthorized intervention, what prevents it from happening again? The Book of Enoch does not end with resolution. That alone should tell you something. Most religious narratives close the loop. They offer reassurance. They seal the moral universe and tell the listener where they stand. They promise that order has been restored, that authority is secure, that the system works. Enoch refuses to do that. Instead, it leaves the universe in suspension. The Watchers are imprisoned, but not destroyed. Judgment is promised, but not executed. History continues, but without closure. This is not a literary flaw. It is a warning, because unresolved systems are not myths, they are risks. Enoch's final sections describe a world that continues forward, carrying unresolved contamination. Humanity survives the flood, but it does not return to innocence. Knowledge persists, memory fragments remain. The architecture of power is altered permanently. The flood does not undo what happened, it limits it. And limitation is not restoration. This framing dismantles one of the most comforting assumptions of later belief, that catastrophe cleanses. In Enoch, catastrophe stabilizes. It prevents total collapse, but it does not correct the original breach. The Watcher's influence does not vanish with them. The knowledge they introduce spreads, mutates, and embeds itself into human civilization. The giants are gone, but the imbalance they created remains. This is why Enoch treats history as fragile, because once a system has been altered beyond its original parameters, there is no true return state. Only management, only containment, and only delay. This leads to one of the most unsettling implications in the entire text. What if judgment is not delayed because it is difficult, but because it is dangerous? What if executing judgment prematurely risks destabilizing the system further? What if the reason entities are imprisoned rather than destroyed is because destruction would release consequences that cannot be contained? These are not theological questions. They are risk assessment questions. And that is precisely why Enoch feels so foreign to later doctrine. Later theology demands certainty. Enoch demands caution. Later theology demands worship. Enoch demands awareness. The Book of Enoch portrays a universe where power is constrained, not by goodness, but by consequence. Authority does not act freely. It acts carefully. Every intervention risks further instability. This is not the worldview of omnipotence. It is the worldview of damage control, which forces a deeply uncomfortable reinterpretation of history. If divine authority operates under constraints, if intervention carries risk, if judgment must be delayed to prevent further harm, then reality is not a perfect design. It is a managed aftermath, and humanity is living inside it. This interpretation explains why Enoch becomes intolerable once religious institutions centralized power. A centralized authority cannot survive on a narrative of uncertainty. It requires moral absolutes, clear chains of command, unquestionable legitimacy. Enoch undermines all three. It suggests that authority once failed, that failure had consequences, and that those consequences are still unfolding. It also reframes obedience. If authority can err, obedience becomes conditional, not blind, not automatic, conditional on competence, conditional on accountability. That is not a religious posture. It is a civic one. And institutions built on divine mandate cannot allow civic logic to infect belief. So Enoch had to go. Not erased violently, but quietly sidelined. Declared apocryphal. Useful for scholars, but dangerous for the public. Because the public does not need to know that power once failed. The public needs certainty. But certainty is a tool, and tools are wielded. The Book of Enoch threatens the monopoly of interpretation. It teaches readers to look for patterns instead of promises, to examine outcomes instead of intentions, to question narratives that insist suffering is necessary, and most importantly, it teaches that responsibility may not lie where it has been placed. This is why Enoch continues to resurface during the periods of technological acceleration, during moments when humanity gains capabilities faster than wisdom, during eras when power becomes asymmetric, because Enoch is not about angels. It is about imbalance. And what happens when those who shape reality are insulated from its consequences? That theme resonates uncomfortably in every age. When weapons outpace ethics, when systems grow too complex to govern, when decisions made by a few ripple outward to affect millions. Enoch warns that such conditions are not new. They are recurring. And recurrence implies pattern. Pattern implies predictability. And predictability threatens authority that relies on surprise, fear, or mystification. Another reason Enoch could not remain central is its treatment of humanity. Humans are not portrayed as villains. They are portrayed as vulnerable, impressionable, unprepared. Humanity does not summon the Watchers. Humanity does not request forbidden knowledge. Humanity receives what it does not understand and pays the price. This reframing dissolves the moral simplicity required for doctrines built on guilt. It suggests that suffering is not always deserved, that trauma can be inherited, that dysfunction can be systemic, and that moral judgment without historical context becomes cruelty masquerading as justice. The Book of Enoch does not absolve humanity, but it contextualizes humanity. And context weakens control structures built on shame, because shame requires isolation. Context builds solidarity. It allows people to recognize shared conditions instead of individual failure. That recognition is dangerous to any system that benefits from fragmentation. Enoch also leaves behind a final, unresolved question, one that lingers long after the text ends. If the Watchers are imprisoned, awaiting judgment, who decides when the time is right? What condition must be met? What threshold must be crossed? The text never says, and that omission is intentional, because it places responsibility not on prophecy, but on awareness. It implies that judgment is not triggered by a date, but by readiness. Readiness to understand what went wrong, readiness to recognize patterns, readiness to prevent repetition. This interpretation transforms the Book of Enoch from an ancient curiosity into a mirror, not of heaven, but of us. It suggests that humanity's role is not passive obedience, but active perception. To notice when power exceeds wisdom, to recognize when intervention becomes interference, to understand that systems collapse not because they are evil, but because accountability is deferred too long. The Book of Enoch survived in fragments because fragments are resilient. They slip through cracks. They resist total suppression. They surface when systems strain under their own weight. And they ask the same question in every era. What if the story you were given is not a lie, but a carefully edited version of something far more complicated? What if certainty was never the goal, but compliance was? And what if the greatest threat to any system of control is not rebellion, but understanding? The Book of Enoch does not demand belief. It demands vigilance. And vigilance, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. If the Book of Enoch unsettles you, it is because it strips away the comfort of moral simplicity. It does not offer villains who can be easily condemned or heroes who can be safely worshipped. Instead, it exposes a structure, one that failed quietly, then reshaped the world to survive its own mistake. And that structure looks uncomfortably familiar. Enoch's universe is not governed by absolute freedom or absolute control. It is governed by thresholds, by limits, placed not on morality, but on stability. The Watchers cross a threshold they were not meant to cross. Knowledge crosses a threshold humanity was not meant to reach. Violence crosses a threshold the earth cannot sustain. At each stage, the response is not outrage. It is correction, containment, delay. This is the logic of systems that cannot afford collapse. And once you see that logic, it becomes difficult to unsee it in the modern world. Because the same pattern repeats wherever power operates without accountability. Institutions intervene with good intentions. Capabilities expand faster than wisdom. Consequences ripple outward. Then come the corrections, regulations, censorship, resets, narratives rewritten to explain why the damage was necessary. Enoch does not describe a God offended by disobedience. It describes a governing intelligence reacting to instability. And that difference is everything. Because if the highest authority is managing risk rather than dispensing justice, then morality is not the foundation of reality. Stability is. This is the idea that could not be allowed to sit at the center of belief, because a belief system built on stability rather than morality invites a different kind of question. Not, is this good or evil, but does this work? And systems judged by effectiveness rather than sanctity do not enjoy blind loyalty. They must prove themselves. This is why Enoch's removal coincides with the rise of centralized doctrine. Once religious authority became institutional, it required a narrative of perfection, a flawless origin, an all-knowing architect, an infallible chain of command. Enoch offered none of these. Instead, it offered oversight failures, delayed judgment, administrators who lost control of their domain, and a humanity caught in the fallout. That story does not inspire worship. It inspires scrutiny. And scrutiny is corrosive to centralized power.
Enoch also threatens another cornerstone of later belief: inevitability. In Enoch, catastrophe is not destiny, it is consequence. The flood is not preordained, it is triggered. The watchers are not meant to fall, they choose to descend. The giants are not meant to exist, they are the result of unauthorized action. Everything that goes wrong does so because someone crossed a boundary. That framing removes the comfort of fatalism. It suggests that disaster is avoidable, that collapse follows patterns, that prevention is possible if boundaries are respected and authority is restrained. This worldview produces responsibility rather than resignation, and responsibility is dangerous to systems that benefit from passivity. Another detail that becomes increasingly disturbing the longer you sit with Enoch is how modern its ethical posture feels. The text does not glorify power. It treats power as something that must be limited. It does not celebrate knowledge. It treats knowledge as something that carries obligation. It does not romanticize rebellion. It shows rebellion's collateral damage. This is not the worldview of an ancient people inventing fantasy. It is the worldview of observers who have seen what happens when systems scale beyond control. Which raises a question that cannot be comfortably answered. Where did that perspective come from? Because ancient mythology typically explains the world through anthropomorphized gods, poetic symbolism. Enoch does something else. It abstracts responsibility. It analyzes consequence. It documents process. It reads like a civilization trying to understand why everything went wrong, and trying to prevent it from happening again. That intention alone makes it dangerous, because it implies learning. And learning implies that catastrophe was not meaningless, which undermines doctrines that rely on suffering being divinely ordained. The Book of Enoch does not sanctify pain, it contextualizes it. And contextualized pain demands reform. This also explains why Enoch resonates so strongly during periods of rapid technological change. Every era that faces the consequences of unchecked advancement rediscovers the same questions Enoch raises. Who is responsible when power exceeds wisdom? Who pays the price for innovation gone wrong? Who decides when intervention becomes interference? And who bears the consequences when oversight fails? These questions are not religious. They are political. They are ethical. They are structural. And they cannot be safely confined to theology. This is why Enoch survives best at the edges, in fragments, in apocrypha, in whispered discussions rather than official sermons, because fragments invite inquiry, and inquiry cannot be controlled once it begins. The Book of Enoch does not tell you what to believe. It teaches you how to look, to examine origins, to question inherited narratives, to notice when explanations feel too clean, too simple, too convenient. It asks you to consider that the world may not be broken because humans are irredeemable, but because the system they inherited was compromised before they ever arrived. That idea is profoundly destabilizing because it shifts the axis of responsibility. It suggests that progress is not about obedience, but about correction, not about submission, but about understanding, and not about waiting for salvation, but about preventing repetition. The final discomfort Enoch leaves us with is this: if reality is managed rather than perfect, if power operates under constraints, if judgment is delayed to avoid further harm, then the future is not predetermined. It is contingent, dependent on awareness, on restraint, on the willingness to recognize patterns before they become catastrophes. That places an uncomfortable burden on humanity, not to worship blindly, but to observe carefully, not to obey reflexivity, but to think critically. That burden is not something institutions like to distribute widely, because awareness cannot be recalled once granted. And systems built on control prefer populations that do not ask how things work. The Book of Enoch asks nothing else. There's a final layer to the Book of Enoch that is rarely discussed openly, even among scholars who acknowledge its influence, not because it is obscure, but because it forces a reckoning. Enoch does not merely describe what went wrong, it implies what must happen next, and that implication is profoundly uncomfortable. Through the text, there's a recurring emphasis on observation. Enoch is shown the structure of reality, the paths of celestial bodies, the places of confinement, the divisions of the earth, the chambers of the dead, the locations where judgment is delayed. This is not revelation for the sake of awe. It is revelation for the sake of comprehension. Enoch is not chosen because he is powerful. He is chosen because he is capable of seeing without intervening. of recording without controlling, of witnessing without worshiping. That distinction matters because it reframes revelation not as divine favoritism, but as a transfer of responsibility. Enoch is shown how the systems work, and once someone understands how a system works, they are no longer innocent. They become accountable. This may be the most destabilizing implication of all, that knowledge itself is a burden, not a blessing. Not a reward, a burden. The Watchers fail because they misuse knowledge. Humanity suffers because it receives knowledge without context. Enoch is different. He is given knowledge without the power to act on it. He is made a witness, a recorder, a carrier of memory. This suggests something deeply unsettling about how correction occurs. Not through force, not through domination, but through awareness carried across time. Enoch's role is not to fix the world. It is to preserve the memory of how it broke. Because systems that forget their failures repeat them. Systems that remember have a chance, however small, of restraint. This interpretation casts the Book of Enoch in an entirely different light. It is not a religious text meant to be obeyed. It is a continuity document, a record designed to survive collapse, a warning embedded in narrative form. And warnings are dangerous because they assume the future still has agency. Later doctrine removes that agency. It tells humanity that everything is already decided, that suffering has purpose, that obedience is the highest virtue. Enoch contradicts this quietly but decisively. It implies that catastrophe follows patterns, that patterns can be recognized, and that recognition creates responsibility. This is why Enoch's exclusion was not merely theological, it was strategic. A population trained to recognize systemic failure does not accept simple explanations for suffering. They ask where decisions were made, who benefited, who bore the cost, and whether the same pattern is repeating under a different name. Those questions are corrosive to any centralized authority because they turn faith into analysis, and analysis is uncontrollable. The Book of Enoch also destabilizes the concept of divine distance. In later belief systems, God is removed from process, abstracted, untouchable, beyond scrutiny. In Enoch, authority is present. It observes, it reacts, it contains, it delays. This is not the behavior of a distant force. It is the behavior of a governing system. And governing systems can be evaluated, not morally, functionally. Did intervention improve stability? Did containment reduce harm? Did delay prevent collapse or merely postpone it? These are not blasphemous questions. They're operational ones, and they cannot be asked safely within a framework that demands reverence instead of understanding. This is why Enoch ends where it does. Not with a prophecy fulfilled, not with judgment executed, but with everything still pending. The Watchers remain imprisoned. The final reckoning remains future-bound. History continues under unresolved tension. This unresolved state places the burden not on divine action, but on human perception. Because if judgment is delayed, then time matters. And if time matters, then what happens during that time matters. Humanity is not waiting for the end. It is living inside the delay, which means choices made now affect the eventual outcome. This is a radical repositioning of agency. It does not elevate humanity above the system, but it refuses to reduce humanity to a passive subject. It suggests that awareness itself may be the variable being tested, whether humanity can recognize imbalance before it becomes irreversible, whether it can restrain power once it understands consequence, whether it can learn from inherited failure instead of repeating it. That possibility is far more threatening than any apocalyptic prediction because it removes the excuse of inevitability. It suggests that collapse is not destiny. It is negligence. The Book of Enoch, in this light, becomes less about the past and more about pattern recognition. It asks whether we're repeating the same errors under new terminology, whether we are again accelerating capability beyond ethics, whether we are again trusting systems that operate without accountability, whether we are again mistaking authority for competence, and whether we're again willing to accept suffering as necessary because questioning the system feels too destabilizing. These questions are not ancient. They are painfully current. And they may be the true reason Enoch continues to resurface whenever civilizations reach a certain threshold, because at thresholds, the past becomes relevant again. Warnings surface, fragments speak, and suppressed narratives regain urgency. Book of Enoch does not tell you what will happen next. It tells you what to watch for, the signs of imbalance, the concentration of power without oversight, the normalization of harm as necessary, the framing of suffering as inevitable, the silence of those who ask structural questions instead of moral ones. These are the precursors to collapse in every system Enoch describes, and they're remarkably consistent across history. Make sure you follow the Broken Truth podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. Leave us a 5-star review, share this episode, and comment your thoughts below. Not because the story is finished, but because attention is the only force that interrupts repetition. The Book of Enoch survives because it refuses to comfort. It refuses to close the loop. It refuses to absolve authority without scrutiny. And it refuses to let humanity off the hook by claiming ignorance. It suggests that the most dangerous moment in any system is not rebellion, but complacency. Because complacency allows failures to compound quietly, until correction is no longer possible. This investigation does not end with Enoch. It begins with it. There's one final reason the Book of Enoch could never be fully erased. It does not attack authority directly. It undermines it indirectly, by teaching people how to think instead of what to think. Most suppressed texts are dangerous because they oppose power. Enoch is more dangerous because it reframes power. It teaches that authority is not defined by position, but by performance, that legitimacy is not inherited, but demonstrated. That trust is not owned. It is earned through restraint. This is not the language of rebellion. It is the language of evaluation. And evaluation is fatal to systems that rely on sacred distance. Throughout the Book of Enoch, authority figures are constantly observed, measured, compared against outcomes. The watchers are not condemned for existing. They are condemned for failing their function, for exceeding their mandate, for introducing consequences they could not control. This is a profoundly modern way of assigning responsibility. It does not moralize power, it audits it. And audits terrify institutions more than opposition ever could, because opposition can be crushed. Audits expose rot. The Book of Enoch also refuses to let anyone escape responsibility by hiding behind intention. The watchers may have believed they were helping. They may have believed humanity would benefit. Their motives are irrelevant. Only the consequences matter. There's another reason Enoch cannot remain central. It strips away the comfort of good intentions. It asserts that harm does not require malice. It only requires imbalance. Power plus access minus accountability. That formula does not belong to ancient religion. It belongs to every modern disaster inquiry ever conducted. And that parallel is not accidental, because Enoch is not about angels. It is about governance failure. This becomes unmistakable when you look at how Enoch treats the future. There is no promise that everything will be fixed. There is no assurance that authority has learned its lesson. There's only delay, suspension, observation, as if the system itself is waiting to see whether humanity will repeat the same pattern, whether it will again elevate power without restraint, whether it will again accept suffering as normal, and whether it will again trust those who promise stability without transparency. This transforms the final judgment from an event into a process, not a divine outburst, a reckoning based on accumulated outcomes. And that framing quietly transfers agency to the present. Because if judgment is contingent, then behavior matters. Not belief, not ritual, but behavior. How power is exercised, how knowledge is shared, how consequences are acknowledged. This is a devastating repositioning of responsibility. It suggests that the future is not sealed. It is being evaluated, moment by moment, choice by choice. The Book of Enoch does not tell you how to escape judgment. It tells you how judgment is formed. And that knowledge is intolerable to any system that thrives on passivity. Because once people understand that outcomes matter more than allegiance, control becomes fragile. This is why Enoch's themes reappear wherever institutions fail. In post-collapse societies, in whistleblower testimonies, in classified reports released too late, in commissions that ask how no one noticed what was obvious in retrospect. The language is always the same. Oversight failed, warnings were ignored, consequences were underestimated, accountability was deferred. Enoch is simply the earliest surviving articulation of that pattern, and it does not flatter humanity. It does not absolve us, but it refuses to scapegoat us either. It treats humanity as a population living inside the consequences of inherited decisions, capable of learning, capable of restraint, capable of breaking the cycle if awareness arrives before collapse. This is why the Book of Enoch does not need to predict the future. It only needs to describe the past accurately. Because systems repeat, and repetition is the most reliable form of prophecy. If power remains unaccountable, collapse follows. If knowledge spreads without responsibility, harm scales. If authority is shielded from scrutiny, failure compounds. These are not spiritual truths, they are structural ones, and structural truths cannot be prayed away. They must be confronted. This is why the Book of Enoch is not a comfort text. It is a diagnostic. It tells you where to look when things begin to fail. It tells you what questions to ask when explanations feel rehearsed. It tells you how to recognize containment masquerading as salvation. And it leaves you with a final, unsettling responsibility. Not to believe, but to notice. Because once you notice the patterns, innocence ends. And with the end of innocence comes choice. Whether to repeat what has already failed, or to interrupt it. The most dangerous idea Enoch leaves us with is not that angels fell. It is that power did, and that the future depends on whether anyone is paying attention when it happens again. Thank you for listening to the Broken Truth Podcast. As always, stay aware, stay awake, and stay questioning the narrative.
In a world built on hidden histories and half-truths, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because what you've heard tonight was never meant to be known, but you were meant to find it. If you're ready to go deeper, leave us a review, comment your thoughts, share this episode, and step inside the archives. Join the inner circle, where the real evidence is kept. This is the broken truth, because the truth isn't whole, it's broken.